in the centre of Plymouth and we're going to meet Phil, who's going to talk to us about Plymouth at the end of the Civil War, what it was like and how the citizens lived. Hello Phil.
Hello Steve. Right Steve, on January the 12th, 1646, Plymouth's participation in the war, the Civil War, the first Civil War, came to an end, and its active participation, when Colonel John Digby left Plympton with his small royalist army and withdrew into Cornwall. That brought the siege and the blockade of Plymouth to a final end. It wasn't the end for Plymouth though, because Salcombe and Exeter and Dartmouth were still under royalist control. Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell came into Devon. That's why Digby withdrew, because they were coming with a big army, the New Model Army, which had beaten the King at Naseby the year before. And we're coming into the West Country, taking town after town, unstoppable. Thousands of trained soldiers, a Roundhead army, never before seen in this country like that. A paid professional army came to the West Country. But our soldiers from Plymouth, part of the garrison, joined this New Model Army to help Thomas Fairfax and Cromwell defeat the rest of the royalist forces within the county and march down into Cornwall and brought about the final surrender of the royalists in Cornwall. It wasn't the end for Plymouth. The royalists surrendered in Cornwall. Cromwell and Sir Thomas Fairfax came to Plymouth, rode into the town. They were applauded by the people and the soldiers as they came in as the saviours of Plymouth, if you like, with what happened, and they won the war really for the parliamentarians. Now, they were in Plymouth, they inspected the forts, they went around and inspected the fortifications, talked to officers, and they were feasted by the mayor, Justinian Peard, and the governor, the new governor, Colonel Rolfe Weldon. After this, they rode away from Plymouth.
And what happened to the people left behind?
Plymouth had not suffered much damage itself. Obviously there was earthworks thrown up all over the place, big mounds of earth, and it had cost the city thousands of pounds to maintain the defence of the city, or the town, for 4 years, on and off, from all these royalist attacks. What happened then was the earthworks, the 5 major earthworks and all the supporting works that were north of Plymouth were just abandoned. Some of them were slighted, knocked down, but they were there. Most of them were still there for nearly 200 years or more. You could still see the remains of these earthworks, low ridges of earth at all the major points and in between.
So these would have been there in like 1850 maybe?
Yeah, before the big housing boom occurred in the 1860s.
What a sight to see, eh? What a sight.
But no surveys were done on them. People wrote that they had seen them, parts of them, and there was cannon found. There was old cannons found. There was one at Hyde Park in that area. There was a cannon found when they dug the foundations for the St Gabriel's Church, and there was piles of old broken weapons that were just abandoned. When they did work on Freedom Fields, when they knocked the old hospital down, somebody found a load of broken muskets, broken swords, musket balls, cannonballs. These things are always turning up along with bones. But at the time of the Civil War, when it came to an end, Plymouth was left destitute, if you like. Our fishing industry had been curtailed. There was no money here. A lot of the soldiers who fought and died were left. No money. They were begging on the streets. Their children were there. Their wives were there. Everything. Right, Steve. As I was saying, the town was left destitute. Whole families suffered this 4 years of warfare, and the town was under siege a lot of that time. Soldiers brought in diseases. Many people died in those 4 years. Here outside St Andrew's Church, the burials were up big time. In the 4 years of warfare, 3,000 people were interred in St Andrew's churchyard alone.
3,000?
Bearing in mind the population was only 6,000 to 7,000. In those 4 years, whole families were buried here at that time. Wounded soldiers who were brought back and cared for, who died, were also buried here. Out of the 3,000, 2,300 of them were men, women and children, more than that. 471 soldiers, some of them officers, Colonel William Gould, were buried here. 471. Those who died of their wounds or who were really famous, you know, celebrities of their day, were buried here. Ordinary soldiers were buried where they fell in battle, up by the earthworks.
In pits.
Yes, or if they went with the army, like those 1,000 men who left Plymouth to join the Earl of Essex in his campaign in Cornwall, only a couple of hundred came back. So those people are buried somewhere, who knows where. Plymstock and Plympton also suffered horrendous losses during those times. There was the Royalist forces. You often read in the burial records of Royalist soldiers dying of wounds and being buried in St Mary's at Plympton and at Plymstock Church. In their hundreds, these were, of disease and wounds. So we don't know the actual figure, but I reckon you could at least add another 2,000 onto that, those who were buried here. A lot of the soldiers who were maimed during the war were left to their own devices at the end of the war as well, and were often seen begging in the streets. And those women who lost their husbands begging on the streets with their children.
Of course, today there's no way we could fit 3,000
No.
people in here.
This area outside St Andrews, all this area here was the cemetery in those days.
It would have gone across the road
Yes.
to there,
Yeah.
and then around here to the what is now the across the road there. So it would be about 2 or 3 times bigger.
Well, there were so many burials here over the years that it became known as the Mound.
So it was like a hill.
That's a lot higher than it is today.
Interestingly,
Full of bones.
Interestingly, Phil, I can still see in my imagination there's an elevation here. If it goes from here across to here, you can actually see that it's probably about 4 to 5 foot higher here than here. So that is perhaps all that's left.
A lot of the bodies were moved to Westwell later on, but the stones have all disappeared. There would have
course,
been
yeah.
monuments, what do they call them again? Gravestones. Captain William Bligh of the Bounty, his father was buried here. And there was a stone, people saw the stone. Colonel William Gould was buried here, the
Mount
saviour
Gould.
of Plymouth.
Mount Gould.
Mount Gould, yes, that's what Mount Gould is named after today. He was the one who saved us at Freedom Fields, the Battle of Freedom Fields, the Sabbath Day fight. So there were a lot of monuments here that have gone to the Civil War people. Mayor Coles, who was the early mayor of Plymouth during the Civil War, one of the later ones, who didn't get on with Wardlaw, Governor Wardlaw and William Gould. His stone, I've seen his stone years ago myself. It's only a small one. But if you can imagine what this place looked like in those days, especially after the nearly 3,000 burials from the Civil War. The grave diggers were even working on a Sunday.
Phil, what do you reckon the possibility is that bits of human bones could still be here? Because this is the back, this really is the back of what's left of the mound, isn't it?
It's the back
What
of
do you
the
reckon?
church. People were buried everywhere. I mean, I was at St Albans Abbey, and outside the abbey they found a grave recently up there, and it was to one of the abbots. So people were buried everywhere, inside the church, outside the church. And the possibility of finding human bodies here still is very high indeed.
In fact, Phil, about 10 minutes ago, we bumped into a person who didn't want to be named,
Yes.
but said he had done some work here some time ago with the
Somebody was digging
for
doing
various
some
reasons,
repairs, and they found.
What did he say, Phil?
They found a human jawbone, part of a human jawbone. And I've looked around here and I've found bits of human bone that have risen up. I've not touched them or anything, but you can see them in there, all around this area, because bones rise. So,
Amazing,
yes.
amazing to think that, isn't it?
Yeah, there could be some soldiers from the Civil War buried here. There are, but
There
yes.
are, yeah. And they're still here.
Yes.
So, Phil, what happened to these disabled folks after the end of the war?
Well, like I said, Steve, they were left to their own devices for several years. And then Parliament decided to introduce a pension scheme. So these people were actually, they had to petition Parliament for a pension, and you had to prove service. So the wounded soldiers would go to their old commanders if they were still around, or write to them if they moved away, and ask for their help. And these soldiers would actually, because a lot of soldiers were illiterate still, so a lot of these officers or JPs or MPs or councillors who knew their service would write to Parliament. And I've got a few petitions I found around some of the country when I was doing my research, if you'd like me to read them to you. Yeah? Right, this was done on behalf of a man called George Gibbs of Holsworthy. And it reads, in the Epiphany sessions of 1649 to 50, so he had to wait longer, this man, whereas your poor petitioner hath ever since the beginning of those distractions adventured his life and fortune in and upon the Parliament service, and received many dangerous wounds in the same, viz. At Mobbury fight his hand split asunder. The Sunday fight, which is the Sabbath day fight, Battle of Freedom Fields, at Plymouth, shot in the left shoulder. At Mount Edgecombe House, dangerously shot in the head. With the Earl of Essex in Cornwall, one shot above the thigh of 18 inches and drawn from Photiou upon a wagon as far as Warden, being of a weak and sickly constitution, oft times deprived of his faculties of using his limb, having 3 small children whose livelihood wholly depends upon him, who hath not a foot of means, nor any money to depend upon for his wife and their subsistence, but it is likely to want, which is very well known to those whose names are here subscribed. And it says, I do know the petitioner to have been a soldier in the Parliament service and to have received diverse wounds. And this is signed by John Penrose of his regiment, Major Thomas Halsey of his regiment. Here's another petition from a soldier called Stephen Webb, and it reads, petition of Stephen Webb, that from the beginning of the late war until the garrison of Plymouth was disbanded by ordinance of Parliament, he had faithfully served the Parliament under the command of Captain Arthur Gay of Plymouth. He was very popular in the area, he was a local commander, and being drawn forth in a party to fight the enemy, received a shot through the shoulders, whereof he was cured, and not long after being drawn forth again to storm Warley House, which is still a house at Plymouth, which the enemy then possessed, where he received a shot in the thigh, which remained by the bone, and causeth an issue to come forth, and will not be cured until nature works it out. He had a wife and 6 small children, and he prays for some relief, without which undoubtedly his wife and children would perish for want. And this was certified by Arthur Gay himself. I've got one more petition to sort of show you. This is from a lady called Priscilla Ambrose, and it was sent to the judges for the Western Counties for relief on account of her husband's death while fighting in the service of the King on the walls of Plymouth, and it was sent on the 25th of July 1649. Now this is, if you read the wording on this, it says, fighting in the service of the King on the walls of Plymouth. This man didn't fight for the King, he fought for Parliament. But it just gives you an idea of the mindset of the soldiers who fought on the Parliament side in the Civil War. They believed they were fighting for the King, even though they were fighting against him. A lot of soldiers thought he was misled by his councillors, and they still loved the King. So I'm just going to read this last petition. It says, to the Right Honourable John Lord Wilde, Baron of the Exchequer, and Colonel Rigby, judges for the Western Counties. And it said, the humble petition of Priscilla Ambrose humbly showeth that your poor petitioner's husband was in the service of the King and Parliament in Plymouth, and lost his life in the service upon the walls of Plymouth in one of the half moons. That means
Earthwork.
a small one between the major forts. They would put these little earthworks up in between.
And where were those again, Phil?
They were
be
spread out, dotted everywhere,
along
all over
North Road?
along the North Road between Eldad Hill and Mount Gould, Lipsome Fort. But they went right along. There must have been about at least 20 or 30 of these, and others along the coast. I, having left to me 3 children, which I and them are likening to perish for want of relief by reason of my said husband's death. And it says, these are therefore to desire your honours to consider my poor, sad and low condition, and to take some course, that I with my children may not perish for want of relief. And I shall ever pray for your honours' health, as duty bindeth me. Very sad that these people have to ask for money after their husbands died fighting for the cause of Parliament. Right, we've left St Andrews and we're walking up towards the Citadel.
Which is directly up
In
here,
front of
isn't
us,
it?
yes, right up here.
And of course, we're standing here on the outer earthworks
Yes.
of the Citadel.
You can't imagine it now, what it looked like. It's completely massive, and it's on its own.
Yeah.
Behind us would have been the so-called inner wall of the city, the remains of what were the friary, the Grey Friars down there. So this would be just countryside. Now, no roads, and we're walking up to the Citadel built by Charles II.
Let's go.
And that's connected with the Civil War.
So Phil, what happened in the 20 years between the end of the Civil War and the construction of the Citadel?
Well, we fought 2 more civil wars.
Two more
Smaller.
civil wars?
Yeah, there was known
Is
as
there
the
not
3
just
civil
one
wars.
civil war?
No, that was the main one. That was the biggest one. The second one, they tried to bring back Charles I to free him. The Scots tried to free him. They were defeated. And on the third civil war, they tried to bring back Charles II. So Charles I was executed in 1649. And a few years later, they tried to bring back his son. But he was forced to flee back to France. And in that period, we had the Republic, or the Commonwealth as people know it, with Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. And that title is not a new title, especially made for Cromwell. The Lord Protector in the old days was the man, a trusted nobleman, who was entrusted with looking after the young king, who was not of age yet. So they called him the Lord Protector. So Cromwell was Lord Protector of the new Republic. And he changed everything dramatically. And it's a sad state of affairs that his mindset was so Puritan. He stopped theatres. If you came up on the Hoe during Cromwell's reign on a Sunday and you weren't in church, you could be fined for walking on the Hoe. If you were drinking on a Sabbath, you were fined. Christmas was abolished by Parliament, not just Cromwell. Easter was abolished. Whitsun was abolished. You couldn't sing certain songs in pubs. You weren't allowed the freedom that you had when there was a king here, and that Charles II would come back with. It was more like communist Russia in a way. There were so many restrictions, you lost a lot of freedom, but the Puritan way was very strict. They told you what to wear, how to act, and you had to be in church. There was people going round. You'd be fined. You'd be thrown in prison. And when Cromwell died, his son Richard was useless. He was worse than the worst thing you could ever think of. So they tried to bring back Charles II. So they went all out to bring back Charles II as king. They brought the king back. Right, we're stood outside the Royal Citadel up on the Hoe. This was started in 1665 by Charles I, who wanted Plymouth to have an important role in the naval defence of England. He recognised Plymouth's strategic importance through its history as well as its position. It wasn't finished in 1670, although it says 1670 above the gate. Construction continued on. And if you look today, it's completely different than it was in those days. It was a massive moat all the way around here. Now,
you can still see the earthworks here.
Yeah, that was the outer ones. And if you look at the period, 1664 to 1667, there was a war between England and Holland, and that was mainly naval. And the Dutch had a good fleet. So we needed a strategic base here on the Hoe overlooking the sea. I'm up here behind the Royal Citadel. I'm just following the road around. And on old maps of Plymouth, the very old maps, up on the Hoe there was a lot of high rocky outcrops. And if you look, you can still see parts of it around the fort, around the Citadel. This because they've obviously built along it, but they've also knocked down a lot. They destroyed a lot of the stone that was up there.
It's very obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very high and rocky, and there was lamb. You could be fine. In the old days, there'd be lambs walking around here. Grassy, rocky outcrop. That's all it was up here for years. And I think it was much higher in those days as well, before they built the Citadel.
And
the Hoe was up. All you'd see up here was a beacon, probably. There was a beacon up here years ago, one of the many that stretched around England to give warnings of an invasion.
And here is the last of the rocky outcrop.
There's a few around, but in the Citadel itself, it's all been flattened. There's more of it here. It spreads right along, and you just cannot get an idea of what it looked like in those days before it was all chopped off, because it goes right along, but the other side there's nothing. It's been flattened, and they probably used the stone for building with. But before Charles II built the Citadel, he came back with one thought in his mind: revenge. Revenge on all those people who signed his father's death warrant, and those places that defied him. And Plymouth was one of those places that defied Charles I.
How did this revenge work then, Phil?
Well, when Charles came back and he was crowned king, he let it go for a few months, and then he decided to take his own back. All the regicides who signed the death warrant of his father were hunted down. Some of these had fled. When the restoration of the king came about, a lot of these regicides knew what was going to happen and fled abroad to Europe, some as far as America. Now, to get these people back into country, he used bribery, threats, promises, which he broke. One of those people that came back was a man called John Carew. His brother, Sir Alexander Carew, was in charge of Drake's Island, as it's known now, St. Nicholas's Island as it was then. And he was accused of treason in the Civil War, taken to London, tried and executed. Now his brother John, a Cornishman from Anthony House over there, was one of those who signed the death warrant for the king, Charles I. He fled to Europe and was brought back on promises of amnesty. Charles gave a promise that he would give amnesty to those who came forward within 14 days. One of those who believed the king's promises, much to his own regret, was John Carew. He came forward, he gave himself up to the king's good graces. What happened? He was tried for regicide, found guilty, and 4 days later was executed on October the 16th, 1660, along with 9 others on that day. Others, like I said, George Downing went around and dragged them out from their holes, brought them back. Most of them were executed. Some were in prison for life. We'll talk about some of those later. Now, being dead, you'd have thought you were outside the king's revenge. Not so. Cromwell's body was dug up from Westminster Abbey, and along with 2 others, John Bradshaw and Colonel Pride, were hung on gibbets. Cromwell's body was then taken down and he was beheaded. And I think his head was still going around the world up until the mid-1980s. I'm not sure of the date, but that's the last when his head was finally buried. Now, they were dug up. They were left to go. They were dug up and thrown away. Others who had opposed the king but had not been regicides, who died before the war, William Stroud, John Pym, and Colonel Nicholas Boscawen, famous West Country MPs and a Cornish cavalry commander, where their bodies were disinterred from Westminster and just thrown into a pit outside Westminster Abbey, right outside a church called St Margaret's Parish Church, which is the actual parish church for Westminster. It's not the Abbey. So there's a plaque on the wall outside St Margaret's, so if anybody is ever in London and Westminster, look at the plaque and you will see the names of about 12 people. Their remains lie in a pit outside St Margaret's Church, and you can still see the indent in the ground. And Nicholas Boscawen, who was in charge of the Plymouth Horse, he's there. William Stroud, MP for Plimpton, he was there. And John Pym, the extreme parliamentarian who helped bring about the rift with Charles I, MP for Tavistock, he lies in there as well. And George Downing went far and wide to bring these regicides to justice, even America. But a lot of them went into hiding, because America's a big country, so a lot of these people went into hiding and managed to evade capture. Just a question, does anyone know what this numbers and letters mean? Is it the postcode for the Citadel?
PL1666. Well, it's 1666, isn't
Yes,
it?
but the
what
PL?
is the PL, or is it PI?
No, it's PL. No.
Oh, it's an L, isn't it?
Yes.
You can see it's an L, PL. Well, perhaps someone will have an answer.
Yeah, because we haven't.
And there appears to have once been something just there.
Bullet hole. This piece of stone here, natural stone, goes all the way along here. Could this be where they had the original fort? I don't think it is, actually, but it looks pretty good, doesn't it? Pretty impressive. And they've tried to face it off here. Goes all along here. You can see if you came up here in the old days, before any buildings were up here, this would have gone right up here. This is a solid rock.
That's solid
ledge.
rock, Phil, isn't it?
It is. And they've chopped it out, some of it. It goes all the way around here, but it's under there. And goes higher over there. There's more of this rock here. So it just, you can't really work out the extent of it. I'd love to have known what it looked like before. As I said, before any buildings were up here. But they've utilised it all to build the fort, haven't they? And before that was the original fort, which is parts you can still see to this day. Around here is a part of it.
Phil, so how did Plymouth in particular suffer by the effect of the anger of Charles II?
Well, after he'd done all the digging up the bodies and everything, I think his anger sort of subsided. He built the Citadel, and a lot of people are under the misconception that he faced some of these guns on the Citadel to face Plymouth, to teach us a lesson. I think that was just folklore. Actually, there's a story that when they built the Citadel, everybody in Plymouth had a hand in helping to construct it. Even old ladies would bring a pebble up and put it there, so they can all say they had a part in building the Citadel. But it wasn't the town that suffered, it was some of the people of Plymouth. Going back to the Charles's revenge, Colonel Lilburne, who was one of Cromwell's colonels in the Civil War, was sentenced to death, not for being a regicide, but for his part in the Civil War. Now, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. And where did they send him? St. Nicholas's Island. Drake's Island had been turned into a prison. Not as it was our main defensive piece of real estate on the foreshore, just before the foreshore. And its strategic position prevented royalist ships from going up the Tamar during the Civil War and coming down to reinforce their troops. So by being there, you could only come this side of it, the north side of Drake's Island, because the channel's deep there. But they dared not do that because we had guns along the foreshore as well. especially at the blockhouses. So after the war, it was turned into a royalist prison for parliamentarians who opposed Charles I. Lilburne was on there to the day he died in 1666, and another famous man who opposed Charles and his restoration, especially Charles II, was General Lambert. He was imprisoned on this island for a while before being set free, taken to another prison. Charles brought in the Corporation Act and the Act of Conformity. This meant that every schoolmaster, priest, every educational minister, anyone in a high position had to agree and accept the Book of Common Prayer. And those who refused could lose their positions. In Plymouth, George Hughes, the vicar of St Andrews, and his son Obadiah refused, and they were sent to Drake's Island, as it's known now, St Nicholas Island, as prisoners. And it was only after friends of his raised the extortionate sum of £2,000 that they were allowed to come ashore, but they were told to leave Plymouth and never come back, which they did. Another one, Abraham Cheer, who became the first ever minister of George Street Baptist Church, the first ever minister. He was in the Civil War as a common soldier in the garrison, and afterwards he became the first minister of this church. He refused to conform. He was imprisoned on Drake's Island. After being first imprisoned in Exeter for 3 months, he still refused. And he was imprisoned again for a period of time. He still refused to agree to it. So he was put on Drake's Island, where he too died. And this happened a lot around the country. People who refused to accept the Common Prayer Book were imprisoned, some of them until the day they died. One who did accept it was, he was called Porter. He was the minister for Charles Church. He accepted, Francis Porter, he accepted the new Common Prayer Book, and he was allowed to stay in his church. But that didn't happen to everyone, unfortunately. So that was another way Charles got his revenge on people, especially in Plymouth.